Welcome to Bamford Rose and it's question of the week. In this week's question of the week, it's engines and engine repairs. And what happens if you're unfortunate for something like this? To happen to you. Now, fortunately, generally speaking, the Aston Martin V8 and V12 engines are fairly robust. There's not a problem like in the Porsche world that you're pretty much guaranteed to have affect every single engine. Now, the V8 engine, let's go through some of the problems that has. Well, we know that tappet, shim and valve train rattle is quite common. Now, if a tappet shim goes out of spec and it's the exhaust shim, then that can be repaired in situ. Unfortunately, if it's an inlet valve tappet shim that's rattling, the engine's got to come out of the car to repair that. That's because the inlet cam with its variable valve control gear on the front of the cam can't be removed with the front cover in place. And to change a tappet shim, you've obviously got to remove a camshaft. Now, the exhaust cam, you can remove that in situ, take the pulley wheel off the chain. That gives you access to the buckets and you can change the shim. But as I just said, you can't do that with an inlet cam. So the engine has to come out of the car to be able to repair an inlet shim that has gone out of spec. The next problem that can affect a V8 is big end bearing failure. Now, we are starting to see quite a few of these creep in. Now, a 4.3 is very rare for a 4.3 to fail its big end bearing. Now, the first 1,000 cars were made with lead indium big end bearings. Now, Ford wanted to get all lead content out of the cars, and a lead indium bearing, although it's very hard and durable, was changed for a tri-metal tin bearing. Now, the tri-metal tin bearing, it passes all durability tests. The test that Aston used to do, 150-hour continuous high-speed test, and the life cycle test, something like a 450-hour life cycle test. It passes all those tests, so there is no inherent problem with the bearing. But the tri-metal tin bearing just isn't as hard as the lead indium bearing, and if some debris got into the top layer of the bearing, then it burrows its way through the top surface layer, and that causes delamination of the top surface layer, which inevitably results in a clearance, which results in a rattling like this. And if you're unlucky enough not to catch it in time, then the rod can snap as the piston fails, and if that punches a hole in the side of the block, then you've lost the block, and that's really bad news. So big end bearing failure has started to creep in on 4.7s. Now, I remember when Bamford Rose was rebuilding 4.7, 4.3 V8 engines for motorsport use, and in something like 2012, when you received a bearing in a packet, on the sticker, on the label, it's got country of origin, and that had changed from a German supplier, and we started seeing China and Japan coming through as country of origin. Now, this is really worrying because that tri-metal tin bearing on the 4.3 and early 4.7s had passed all of those stringent Ford stipulated durability tests. Now, when Aston was away from Ford, you have to ask the question, did they carry on with those harsh durability standards, or did they allow their standards to slip slightly and reduce the onerous, the arduous durability test that the engine was put on? And it's this new or later level part which I think you're starting to see fail on 4.7s. Now I'm also starting to see on 4.7s a little bit of piston slap. Now here's a V8 engine that is exhibiting some piston slap. When this engine was stripped and we measure the liner, instead of being cylindrical and somewhere between the grade 1 to grade 3 piston diameter, it's gone oval, typically about halfway down the bore, which is where piston slap sort of arises from. And there are 4.7 engines that now are exhibiting a little bit of piston slap, and as I say, when you measure them, they've gone oval and you can't machine them back to, what is it, 91.030, which is a grade 3 piston. So these engines have to be overbored slightly and a bespoke piston made. So that's the typical V8 failures: tappet shim, big end bearing failure, liners wearing oval. Now come on to V12. Their typical failures, well, they do rattle on the valve train, but because it's a hydraulic lash adjuster system, you can fix all of those in situ. We now come on to the three well-known failures for V12. One is going to be the breather circuit failing, which allows for a small amount of oil to be carried over during normal operation, and you wouldn't notice this. It wouldn't result in blue smoke out the back, and this is just a gradual reduction in oil volume. The tip on the bottom of the dipstick is about 6.5 litres. Now if you had an oil level that was just on the tip of that dipstick, the ball of the dipstick, and you took it down a motorway cruise and maybe, you know, a couple of hour journey down a motorway, the reduction in oil volume is going to mean that there is a starvation of oil, and that will present itself as oil being starved to the crankshaft journal on the rear, cylinders 6 and 12, and it's going to spin the big end bearings and fail the crank journal on those cylinders. So I've seen a lot of videos on the internet where people have stripped these engines down and said it's a design error, there's oil starvation. Well, it's not, you know. If the human body runs critically low on blood, it's going to die. If the oil level wasn't maintained at somewhere between minimum and maximum, and it goes critically below minimum, then that engine's going to die. So, you know, there's no inherent oil supply issue. It's just that the owner was unfortunate enough not to detect that the breather circuit was failing, didn't realise the engine was consuming a little bit of oil, and that's been allowed to run in that situation for too long, and it's resulted in engine failure. Next failure is going to be the dreaded DB9 tick. Now this is probably one or the other, most cases both. It's either going to be small end bush wear, or it's going to be piston slap in the liner. Now I've got a link to a couple of videos that we've done about this in the past, so good point on the V12 engine to pause this video, go and watch those videos about the dreaded DB9 tick, and then come back to this video. The next failure on V12 is primary catalyst ingestion. Now there's a lot of people that can't get their heads around this. If your catalyst fails, how can the engine ingest that debris, and how can that fail your engine? Well, the primary catalyst is super close to the exhaust port outlet on the cylinder head, and to cut a long story short, the V12 engine has a huge valve overlap, a huge overlap between the intake and exhaust camshaft timing. This is to suck back up spent gas, and this has been programmed to happen. This is internal EGR, and it is designed, put there in place to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. What they didn't think about was that Could the catalyst fail? And if it did fail, would that debris get sucked back up into the chamber? Which it does. Now, unfortunately, this is a really common problem. And the best thing you can do, and if I owned a V12, day one of my ownership, would be to remove that primary catalyst. You get 30 brake horsepower, remap the engine management system so there's no error lights, and with the high flow secondary cat you're going to get a real nice exhaust note, so there's some benefit for doing that. Now that job here at least comes in with the VAT at £3,000, and that all up £3,000 cost to do that primary cat delete on the V12 is going to be the VAT element of an engine rebuild. So that's why, day one of my ownership, get that primary cat out. It's just causing me a liability. For no gain whatsoever, I can pass the MOT on the secondary cat. So those are the three failures on V12. Catalyst ingestion from misfire, typically spark plug or coil related. Breather circuit leading to low oil volume, which causes the big end bearings to fail. And the dreaded DB9 tick, which happens mainly to early 2004 to something like 2006, 2007 cars, where the small end bush of those cars didn't have an oil channel in, the newer cars do, and the dreaded DB9 tick is either the conrod and piston pin rattling, or it is because the liners have worn oval and it's piston slap. So all those problems have crept in over the years. You know, when we started in business in the Aston world in 2010, 2011, then the cars were quite new, very new, mileage was low, and engine issues didn't really occur. But over the last 12 years, then typically what is now 16, 17-year-old cars suffer 16 or 17-year-old car problems, and with mileage now being quite high, 50, 60, 70,000 miles, where previously 10 years ago it was nowhere near that, means that now there are some failures creeping in. Now, up until about 2019, the fix for a broken engine was a remanufactured engine. Now, I say up until about 2019 because since then the factory haven't been supplying them. Perhaps the factory will supply a remanufactured engine in the future, but I think looking at how their prices are creeping up, then the aftermarket world is now going to start rebuilding engines because the cost of that remanufactured engine is just too high. So if we retrace the history on remanufactured engines, then the dealer network back in 2010, 11, 12, when these cars were still quite new, they never ever repaired engines. You know, if you got a big end bearing failure, for instance, a franchise dealer would not be taking the engine out of that car, rebuilding it with new crank, new rods, and rebuilding it. This was a major job, and no franchise dealer, probably apart from Works, has got the facility to do that. You need a clean engine build shop, and you need different equipment in an engine build shop than you need in a vehicle workshop. A lot of these dealers are on old premises. Their workshops are quite small for just the cars anyway, so they've got absolutely no prospect of offering an engine rebuild area. So what happened in the franchise dealer world is that the dealer would just order a remanufactured engine, and no matter how small or how big the failure, so if this was on V12 hydraulic lash adjusters rattling, or if it had failed its big end bearings, then the answer was a remanufactured engine. You know, box fitters is pretty much all dealers are anyway, and the engine was just treated as a box. Yours had gone wrong, it got taken out, and a remanufactured engine put in. So if you look at the prices for those remanufactured engines, then the V8 was trading at about 11.5 grand plus VAT, and the DB9 V12 engine, V12Vantage DBS, whichever variant it was trading at about 13.5 plus VAT. Now that was for what was called a long block, or just a bare block, heads, block and internals, and what you had to do was remove your engine, take off all the dress items, ancillaries, wiring harness, exhaust manifolds, inlet manifolds, everything, transfer it over to your new engine. So it was probably about a 15-hour labour job to take the engine out, probably about a 10-hour labour job to transfer everything over, and another 10 or 15 hours to put the engine back in the car. So you've got your cost for the engine, if it was a V8, 11.5 grand, and then you've got the cost for something like, I don't know, 50 hours labour. If the hourly rate was £100 per hour, you've got 5 grand in labour, and you've got consumables. The other benefit of that remanufactured route is that it's really quick. You know, if you've got a car that drives into the workshop and you identify that the engine is broken, you order your remanufactured engine. It comes within about 3 or 4 days. You take the engine out of the car, you do the swap over of the dress items, you fit it back into the car, and then that car is driving away probably in 2 weeks. So because a car could come in and out of a workshop in 2 weeks, because the price was sort of palatable, maybe 17 grand in the case of the V8 when it's installed, maybe 20 grand for the V12 when it's all installed. That was the fix that even the independent world mostly did. And here at Bamford Rose, over the last 10 years, we've fitted quite a lot of remanufactured engines. Now, there are a couple of downsides to that. You have to give back a serviceable exchange. If you don't, you have to pay 100% surcharge. So if a piston had come out the side of a block, that 11.5 grand V8 engine, because you couldn't give back a serviceable exchange, turned into over 20 grand plus VAT just for the engine. Also quality. Now, I know of a couple of remanufactured engines, V8s, that were here that either failed on the ramp, you know, this is like leaking out coolant from a head gasket, or had a catastrophic failure like 1,000 miles in and put many pistons and rods outside the block. I also had a V12 remanufactured engine just before they stopped doing them in about 2019. And, you know, I paid 13.5 grand plus VAT for this engine. And when we got it, took the spark plugs out, put a video imaging camera down, the pistons were used, the head hadn't been cleaned up, and at the top of the liner where the piston reaches top dead center, you could see the telltale carbon build-up of many previous miles being run. So maybe that engine had come in on exchange and it just failed a big end bearing, and somebody had thought, well, okay, the top end, the pistons and liners is serviceable, and they just repaired the big end bearing. But a remanufactured engine needs to be remanufactured. So really, for your 13.5 grand for the V12, you want brand new pistons, brand new liners, brand new valve train, everything should be new. So with a few quality concerns on V8s, not quite a remanufactured engine in 2019 on a V12, then I stopped buying remanufactured engines from the factory. But that sort of coincided with the factory stopping supply of remanufactured engines themselves. Now, I know from my time back in the factory in engine design and development that remanufacturing, it was never someone's full-time job. It was a bit of a coffee break job to manage. And Aston have used all of the top suppliers in the country, and they can never keep a contract going, mainly because they can't commit to volume. And, you know, like Jag Land Rover, they're going to be remanufacturing their V8 engines on an industrial scale. Aston, they're much, much smaller in volume, and none of the big players, certainly back in the day when I was looking after it, wanted the headache of doing the remanufacturing contract for such small volume. And you can tell over the last 10 years that we've certainly seen different companies supplying the remanufactured engine. They've come with different identification marks, different little plaques that have got engine numbers on, and just by the bungs and other hardware that the engine has got for transit, and just for care and attention from sealant on the front cover. There's lots and lots of telltale signs that you can tell that they were using different suppliers over the last 10 years. So we started to get to 2019 and then this joint sort of decision of engines not being available anyway and price being too high and quality being suspect, that I made the decision that I'd never sell a remanufactured engine from the factory. You know, if an independent garage buys a remanufactured engine, they stick it in the car, it goes wrong, then the customer is quite rightly going to say, well, you've sold me this engine, it's gone wrong, and the garage is going to have to take on the chin removing that engine, having a discussion with a dealer back to the factory of why the engine's gone wrong and it's nothing to do with them, to hopefully receive a new remanufactured engine and stick it back in the car. So that independent garage is going to have to suffer 50 odd hours labour just to recover a warranty claim that was quite rightly made because the engine went wrong. You only have to be in that situation once to say you're never going to do that again. But it's not all doom and gloom. And this is where the Bamford Rose Aston Martin Engine Repair Centre comes in. It commercially makes sense because as the factory is undoubtedly going to walk up the price of a remanufactured engine when they start supplying them again, and they're going to have to, because there are going to be cars out there that are less than 10 years old and they need a replacement engine because they've had catastrophic failure. Their current engine cannot be rebuilt. Now, every automaker on the planet is obliged by law to be able to, through the sale of spare parts, keep cars that are 10 years old or younger on the road. So let's just say you are in your Rapide S from 2017 and you've had a catastrophic engine failure because your breather circuit failed and that spun the big end bearings, the rod lost control and the piston, and the rod exited the block and left a nice hole, meaning that it wasn't rebuildable. The factory have got to supply a replacement engine for that car. Now, it doesn't matter how much it costs. Legislation says that you must supply spare parts for 10 years to keep the cars on the road. You've only got to supply the part. You can charge whatever you want for it. But in that case of the Rapide engine losing its block, then they need to supply a complete replacement powertrain unit, which, if they're not remanufacturing, which they haven't been since 2019, then they've got no option. Even if that car had a warranty, even if it had a approved used warranty, they've got no way to rebuild that car and put it on the road. This is why they must and they will start remanufacturing. But parts prices on the Astons are creeping upwards and upwards and upwards. Now, one reason why for the last 10 years we chose to fit remanufactured engines is because if you look at the parts and labour and machining costs to rebuild an engine, if you look at what they were selling the remanufactured engine for, then they were very comparable, and in some cases it was cheaper to go the remanufactured route. You know, if you've had a catalyst failure and that debris has been ingested, it has scraped its way up and down the piston rings, that grinding paste has gone into the sump, and now that grinding paste is in the oil and it goes to all crank and cam journals, then the cost to rebuild that engine is monumental, and it is going to be far cheaper to buy a remanufactured engine. But as they undoubtedly walk the price of remanufactured engines up, you know, they were 13.5 grand for a V12. If that goes to 15.5, 16.5 as they resupply, as they renew their remanufacturing contracts in years to come, then we're actually going to be able to build the engine cheaper in the repair world than that remanufactured engine. But the aftermarket repaired engine is going to be better than that remanufactured engine. You know, remanufacturing engines is an industrial process. It's done to production line standards. If you rebuild an engine in an engine rebuild workshop, especially a dedicated specialist like Bamford Rose, then you're going to have some care and attention that's gone into that rebuild. The compression ratio is going to be optimized. There's going to be a little bit of porting go on to relieve a few extra horsepower, the blueprinting process as it's called. So you're going to get a blueprinted engine from the specialist. Now if you look on the V12, because we just used that Rapide S engine price as an example, then complete new valve train. So this is hydraulic lash adjusters, finger followers, valves, then complete new pistons, connecting rods, bearings, crank, seals and gaskets that you need to rebuild that engine. Going to be looking at about £12,000 plus VAT parts. To machine the liners, to skim the cylinder heads, to deck the block, and all machining work required in that rebuild is going to be about £2,000. The engine rebuild labour itself is going to be about £4,000. That means that separate to the labour to remove the engine and refit it to the car, just to rebuild to a professional and proper standard, a V12 engine is going to be in the region of £18,000 plus VAT. Of course, if an engine just had one particular specific problem, if it was just a worn or cracked piston on one liner in one cylinder, but let's just say the car had done 60,000 miles. Now you've got to take that engine out and you might get away with a bargain basement repair of just one piston and carry over the valve train. Don't renew the lash adjusters, don't even take the valves out the cylinder head, and don't even renew crankshaft bearings. Now if you did that as a commercial activity, as a garage, that very basic repair, you invested all the time to take the engine out of the car, you did the basic repair, you put that back in, and something went wrong, then even though the customer probably wanted that bargain basement repair, they're always going to come back and say, well, you know, this has gone wrong, you rebuilt my engine for me. So engine repairs on the cheap just offer huge liability to the garage without really any great return. So certainly at Bamford Rose, I'm only ever going to do complete repairs. So this is going to be treating every engine as a complete refresh. Everything gets renewed, because then everything is perfect and there can be no problems going forward. So some people might say, after I gave that price rundown, that an engine doesn't cost that much to repair. Well, if you zero time it, it does. And rebuilding engines, I'm only interested in zero timing. That means every single component new. I have seen, and there's an advert on eBay now where it's a V12 engine repair from £6,500. I've also had one of those cars with one of those engines in it in my workshop, absolutely smoking itself to death, and the outfit offering that repair with the tail between the legs, I've had to come here and collect the car. So that's why the price of rebuilding an engine is high. It cannot be done half-assed. It has to be a complete refresh, knowing that that car going forward has been well served. Everything is zero timed. That car can be relied on for 100,000 miles instead of it being patched up and offered for sale for a cheap price. But if it was just tappet shim or another issue that the engine had, and that was detected at service and it was fixed preventatively before a larger failure happened, then it's possible to do cheaper repairs other than a complete strip and rebuild. But this is the problem in the Aston world, and this is not just engines, this is for every single component on the car. Of course, there are petrol head owners where the car they have is the one. It's their car that they're going to keep and cherish forever, and no matter what goes wrong in it, they want to fix it. They want to do preventative maintenance because they get that if you preventatively fix something, that is inevitably going to be cheaper than the fix when it catastrophically goes wrong and more needs repairing. The problem is what I call stepping stone owners. These are the owners that they've had a sum of money, whether it be inheritance or a bonus or whatever it is. Let's just say it's £40,000-50,000, and they want to tick the Aston ownership box, but their other half has probably got designs on that money, and whether it be a conservatory, new windows or a new kitchen, then the chunk of money is begrudgingly given for a period of time just so that their other half can tick that box of Aston ownership. What their plan is they want to buy at a cost, but they want to check out at that same cost. They don't want to spend a single penny on maintenance in the meantime, because ultimately they're just lightly using the car for a few years to tick the box, and then they're going to sell it. These are the people that, even though they know better, will keep saying that servicing at the main dealer is the way to go. And you want the stamp for a main dealer service, but then get the independent to take care of any repairs. This is because they know that the new naive green buyers into the Aston world are going to see a franchise stamp and think that's the best. And if the book is full of franchise stamps, then that car is going to have the highest resale value, and they're going to achieve what they wanted to do, which is to check out at the price they checked in at. So if those stepping stone owners get told when they're in a service that they've got a little bit of an undesirable rattle, whatever it is, piston, valve train, they'll never preventative maintenance fix, and they'll trade the car on. So preventative maintenance fixing issues before they turn into something bigger is advisable. And if you are buying, a proper pre-purchase inspection check of the engine, I don't know, RAC, AA, whoever it is, I don't know, they will do a pre-purchase check, and a box is the engine and it gets ticked. Well, what does that actually mean? Have you assessed noises? Have you put a chemical sniffer test in the coolant water to check that there's no carbon monoxide, and that would be a head gasket leaking, for instance? How in depth has that check on the engine gone? So when buying an Aston, like people do when buying Porsches, because there are so many Porsches being traded with engine problems, you really need an in-depth pre-purchase inspection. And if you've got an in-depth pre-purchase inspection, if you fix issues preventative before they develop into something bigger, then the likelihood is your Aston engine won't have a failure, and you won't have to be seeking a rebuild in a workshop like the Bamford Rose Aston Martin Engine Centre. So, because the remanufactured engine is pricey, problematic, supply of it just isn't there, that's why we opened Bamford Rose Engine Repair Centre. Now, this is really personally satisfying for me, because before entering into the garage world, I was engine design development engineer for many companies. Now, this encompasses mechanical development, performance development, emissions and calibration. So I really got involved with engines at a prototype level, and to now have our own engine build shop is, as I say, very satisfying. Now, as you can see from our engine build shop, we've got this dedicated vehicle workshop side, and we've got our engine strip and build area, clean area and a dirty area. Because engine rebuild is a completely different function than what normally happens in a vehicle workshop, is why any decent engine rebuild centre needs to be completely away from a normal vehicle workshop side. At Bamford Rose, as you know, we make a lot of our upgrade equipment, exhaust manifolds, catalysts, that's all made on site here. And we've also got a bit of an engineering workshop going on. So we've got a milling machine here that we can skim heads and blocks on. So we're pretty self-sufficient. So there you have it, Bamford Rose's answer to the supply and repair of Aston engines issue in the UK. Now, I do feel for owners outside of the UK, especially markets where Aston sold to predominantly in those early years. Aston sold about 30% of its sales volume to the States, 30% Germany. What is happening for engine repair in those countries? If the UK has got, and the UK was another 30% market, and there's a lot of cars suffering engine failures in the UK, and it's really difficult to get those cars properly fixed in the UK. What is happening in America and Germany? Especially as well smaller countries, maybe like Spain and France, where there's barely a dealer network. So I feel really for those owners, but at least Bamford Rose has got an answer for Aston Martin engine repairs. Now join me on next week's question of the week, where I take a look at a DB9 that's been advertised on the market at a distressed price because it needs a new motor, and we'll go into the cost of repair and see if that distressed price is right. I don't think it will be. But anyway, that's next week's question of the week. Really hope you liked this week's question of the week, and it really helps us if you can subscribe to the channel, click us a like, and comment on your experience of engine repairs in the Aston Martin world.